Is it Julian who's going to present this? I have some
Well, this was
material,
this was your question, and then Evan, you can take it away, and then I'll whatever.
Yeah, basically, I know that at the end of the philosophy sequence in the Chesterton curriculum, there's a discussion about distributism, and
I actually
and I know that it favors distributism.
But I didn't see the phrase
interprets
distributism.
and I know it interprets Rerum Novarum as rejecting a kind of taking, extreme distributism to an extreme, that socialism and communism are the extreme of distributism. Distributism is the mean. I don't know much more than that though, and I know that I think there's a good chance that the school that I'm headmastering will take on the Chesterton curriculum in the future, if/when we add a high school. And so I was knowing that Phil and Joe are very sort of contra distributism. I wanted, at least last week, though we were sort of getting to the end, whether they thought I would be able to teach that in good conscience, when the time comes. And you, Evan, having way more experience with the Chesterton curriculum than any of us do, it was just a question of like, what do you think about that? What do we think about distributism in general? Is it just by nature something undesirable? What's the deal?
So was that last one directed at me or the other guys? Because you asked a couple questions.
Yeah, it's. I guess it's sort of mostly you, Evan.
Yeah, we already developed our opinions last week and took bets on what you would say. So that's really what this is.
Well, we mostly did it over text. We didn't talk a lot about
Interesting.
it.
Yeah, well, so you guys know I went to Hillsdale College, where I got my undergraduate degree, and going into Hillsdale, I was
they're pretty free market over there.
Oh yeah, and you have to take some of their econ classes to get a degree there, and I was happy to do that. I was raised in a pretty solidly conservative household, and it was mostly fiscally conservative. You might say socially conservative, light in some areas, or at least not aware of the larger tradition of social conservatism, but definitely keyed in on that big tent Reagan era fiscal conservatism that, take it or leave it, your opposition to abortion, take it or leave it, this or that, before the religious coalition kind of swept in and decided some of those issues for right wingers. So I took my intro courses in economics at Hillsdale and was fairly well satisfied, at least early on. I distinctly remember my first year, I was really gung-ho about the founders. I took now, for what it's worth, it would be a mistake to think of the founders as laissez-faire free market types. They were not. That would be sheer anachronism. That developed later in the United States. But we could talk about that if you want to, but that's beside the point. But I remember encountering Locke for the first time and just being disgusted. Like I didn't really have any philosophical training. I just knew there was something off about this, that all rights are to be understood basically in terms of property rights, in terms of the fundamental right to self-ownership. That seemed upside down to me, that there have to be rights beneath the very notion of property. And I couldn't articulate it, but that really bothered me until I encountered people like Aristotle and St. Thomas. And then I felt some relief. So I came from, you might say that laissez-faire background. I read people like von Mises, Ludwig von Mises, Hayek, and I even knew some Randroids. some disciples of Ayn Rand.
What was that? I missed it, Phil.
This is Mises.
Oh, von
Mises. Yeah. So I'm fairly familiar with those guys, and it was a part of the culture on campus. I read some of the books. We had to read large sections of Road to Serfdom by Hayek. We had to read On Liberty and other works by Mises. It's in the air. There you go. Anyway,
you also read Aristotle's Politics there, right? I've seen them like have YouTube seminars on the politics. Hillsdale.
They do, yeah. I encountered them first there. Yeah, so I noticed some discrepancies, right? Like one, and this could bring me up to distributism. One major discrepancy that I see between an Aristotelian approach to economics and the way that von Mises approaches it is that Aristotle says explicitly that the art of wealth making is subordinated to the art of home making, to the making of an oikos, right?
What he calls
krematistique
to oikonomike, right? That's the
right. And it's important to understand what an oikos is for Aristotle. He's a default agrarian, I'm not even sure that it's by some kind of theoretical predilection. He just never encountered industrialism, right? So when he uses the word oikos, he means a house,
the plantation,
heavily staffed.
That's how
plantation, but also a productive facility. In Greece and in Rome, there were chambers on a wealthy man's house where the essentials were manufactured, right? So you weren't really fully a free man if you were a tradesman, because you were always attached to some free man in his household. So that the aristocratic family and all, it's like a little feudal microcosm. The whole ancient world was feudal by default. It just had these superstructures of things, things like Roman confederation on top, but the family structure always remained the same. So what struck me as appealing when I first encountered somebody like Chesterton or Belloc writing about economics is that the piece that was left out of the story by these classical liberal economic theorists was now present. But here's an economic theory that gives credence to the importance of the family right up front. It doesn't treat the consumer as if he's atomized, as if he's just the individual, and all capital as if it's all the same, whether it's liquid or it's productive property. And by productive, I mean, generating wealth rather than being fit for exchange. So we can talk more about that. I also at the time read Leo XIII. I read Rerum Novarum, and one way to define the movement that Chesterton and Belloc started in the 30s, or earlier, excuse me, in the early 20th century in England, was an attempt to take the principles of Rerum Novarum and just apply them. And the similarities are shocking. Yet, like Rerum Novarum, both Chesterton and Belloc rejected extreme capitalism, what they saw as extreme capitalism on the one hand. It's worth bearing in mind what extreme capitalism looked like in the late 19th century, right? That looked like child laborers. It looked like the world of Oliver Twist, right? On the one hand, and the gin still, right? Like men working long hours and then going and blowing their paychecks, drinking themselves to sleep so that they could wake up hungover and go back to work, right? That was it's worth noting that's also kind of Marx's London too, that kind of thing could be seen there. So you had the extreme of capitalism on the one hand, but you also had socialism, which both Chesterton and Belloc avowedly rejected because they believe that the right to private property is basic, essential. So the rejection of capitalism and socialism both is a hallmark of Rerum Novarum as well. So we can take this any direction you want and go into more detail, but I think it's important to really understand what it is we're rejecting. I'm also fairly familiar with a lot of even though I don't know that I'd characterize myself as like a dogmatic distributist, I still have a lot of sympathies with the mission that they tried to start. But I know that there are a lot of capitalist caricatures of what they were trying to do too, and a lot of misunderstandings. Selective readings of Rerum Novarum too on the part of Catholic capitalist apologists too, where they emphasize very strongly the condemnations of socialism, and they should. But then when it comes time to talk about what Leo XIII had to say about unrestrained free markets, they're awfully quiet. So
Sure.
Anyway, go ahead.
I have a ton of questions if Julian doesn't have any.
No, you go ahead, Joe.
All right. Well, I want to going back to the household. So what would you say the difference is in between the household and the so you said the household, you didn't say self-sufficient, but you said that they had all the necessities, right? What's the difference?
Well, self-sufficient for survival, a complete house is, but not self-sufficient for flourishing. Right?
So what's lacking?
You mean in a household by itself, an individual household?
Yeah, what's lacking in this household?
Proper form of law, equality between parties, an ability to resolve disputes that isn't.
Why couldn't the head, the pater familias, be the king, so to speak, of this political community?
Well, Aristotle says that he kind of could be, that you could have a nation that's born out of shared ancestry, but it would make a formal difference if he bound himself to legal formalities. And that's usually so if we're thinking about politics one, right, the difference between the family and the polis is a formal difference. And it's not that you can't have hereditary rule according to Aristotle, it's just that you need the form of law, and you don't get that just from a strong family, right? That's one of his main points in politics one.
And why couldn't you?
I mean, you don't have things like promulgation. I think that's one of his points. You don't have an attempt to articulate the formalities of the Constitution, right to succession. So you often do have states that kind of grow out of very powerful warlords' families, but they really only come into their own politically once you have to lay down rules that govern the transmission of power. And there's usually a period where it's not at all clear who should inherit rule, right? So if you start with, because we're not talking about like a single family that just. We're talking about a fully self-sufficient house, right? And that usually only happens where you have other families and division of labor and things like that. So,
well, the thing is, I'm imagining really not just, of course, one building, but a number of buildings centered around one main building, in which or around which are produced all of the food, the water, the sanitary needs of this particular local community. Their clothing is taken care of. Their livestock is, reproduces and self-sufficient. They can make leather and clothing and whatever they need from what they have. So all that seems to be missing, the way we set it up, is for the paterfamilias to just say, all right, here's the rules of the house, and here my security guard, they're going to enforce these rules. And then you've got a monarchy. It just seems too close. And it seems to me like that the Aristotle might have had a broader sense of what was included in the household than a truly self-sufficient manor, M-A-N-O-R.
So, okay, so let me just try to rephrase that. So what you're suggesting is that, well, it's worth distinguishing what I mean by the oikos and what Aristotle means by the oikos from the oikos of the opening arguments of politics, where he's imagining the generation of a polis from pre-political constituent elements, right?
Okay.
It exists in both states. There's a risk of equivocation here. The oikos ultimately reaches its fulfillment in the polis as well, but it's also quite different. It can avail itself of things like the division of labor within a polis and the goods that are available thereby. So yeah,
All right.
I
Let's
think
talk.
that if you're on a
Division of
farm,
labor is something I principally have in mind that I'm trying to find here.
okay, go ahead.
So when you say the household is sufficient, I'm thinking that means that what is required for the human life is present there, right? And so I'm thinking that doesn't mean that one house is. I mean, all houses probably, at least in Rome and in Greece, right, would produce food, but probably others would be locally present to fish, and others would be locally present to iron deposits, and they would then go to market and trade those goods, right? So self-sufficiency in like the very strict sense doesn't seem to obtain. So I want to know what we mean when we call this the household self-sufficient.
I'm not gonna. I don't know that there's anything. If I threw out the phrase self-sufficient,
Yeah, you didn't. Sorry,
I just meant.
having
Yeah,
the basic
I just meant.
necessities,
I
right?
just meant comparatively. I just meant comparatively, right? It needs some of its own. It has productive property. It actually has built into it as some of the means of production, as opposed to a society of renters. That's what I was thinking. Okay, so that's all I meant. Not that it's radically self-sufficient.
The core of the
Let me just
distributist.
say the distributists don't. They're not radical agrarians. They don't think that there should be no division of labor. They're not saying that. They're not saying that society should devolve into a bunch of homesteads. They're just saying that it's a better arrangement. Things are better off, and it's more in accord with nature if more men own the means of production.
That's right.
Then effectively work a job for a wage to use those means to produce.
Yeah,
right.
That's right. That if you're a blacksmith, you should own your own furnace and hammer or whatever, right? That no one else should ever own the furnace and pay you to work there. Or
Well,
that
wait a
no
minute.
one else should ever own or like, if you're a tanner, I don't know actually what you require for tanning, but to your point.
This is actually one of those caricatures, though, that I want to talk about. You swung to the opposite extreme and said that the distributist platform is that nobody should own and lease or things like that. I mean, they don't go that far, and I have to say that distributism is more like a mood, and that's what is expressed in Leo the 13th. It's just that it would be better off if more people, especially politically enfranchised people, had a basic share in the economy, the production of wealth, not just the using of tools owned by others for the sake of producing something which exists only for exchange, but that you actually participate in the fundamental economic processes. So they didn't believe that. They also observed explicitly the principles of subsidiarity, and that goes two ways. The principle of subsidiarity goes two ways, not just down, right? But it also goes up if the task requires more centralized coordination.
Yes.
For instance, Belloc in his essay on the restoration of property says, and this is early pharmaceuticals, he says, look, the production of pharmaceuticals requires some centralized coordination that can't be done just at the household level. So we should coordinate there. But there's what he said. He looked out at an economy, and again, so did Leo, saying the exact same things. And he just said, it seems like we haven't adequately observed this principle. We more should be devolved to the citizen head of household than we're finding, which is where a lot of productive property is being concentrated in the hands of the few. And so again, it's their preference that it be more widely distributed, but not that there's some injustice done anytime there is centralization. I just want to clarify that.
Yeah, that's good. So taking the pharmaceutical example, somebody who works in pharmaceuticals, say they're in a lab, right?
Mm-hmm.
Presumably they would never be able to be in such a condition that they could purchase for themselves the capital of an entire laboratory, pharmaceutical laboratory, right? So there's going to have to be a corporation that owns that instead, for which they will be, or by which they'd be employed. So is the distributist here just saying that as we ought to emphasize that workers should own more of the means to production, recognizing also that they can't own it in every industry, like the cell phone industry and the tech industry and so many industries, right? So
Yeah, they
then
explicitly say that.
let's take another more agrarian example, like a plantation, right? Like what's that Mexican company that was
Monsanto.
no, the one that was under fire for supporting Trump was the example I was trying to use. Doesn't really matter.
Goya.
Goya, yeah. So
Yeah.
Goya is able to bring olives to my Kroger at a very affordable price, right? Because they are centralized, and as a result, I'm able to get my olives cheaper, and as a result, I'm able to do other things with my capital, right? Like maybe even buy my own means of production, right? So, is it
if they're available for purchase? It's important that this Greta grew up in Europe too, where land is not so widely available as it is here. It is harder to purchase productive land in Europe than it is here in the United States. And what they saw was a risk for when you have that kind of crowding and limited land, a greater risk of monopolization. So these guys, can I throw another question at you just to get the juices flowing so that we're all on the same page? I don't want to suspend it. I guess if I were running this, I would have begun by just saying, what do you guys think of cronyism in capitalism? Is cronyism bad? Is it bad when business owners use their financial power to influence government?
Yes.
One of the main points of Belloc's servile state is
one of the first well, just real quick, because I think I know the point you're making, but I'll let you make it anyway. But yeah, one of my first disputations, and usually when I talk with distributists or anything, and we use like the economy of the United States as an example, my first disputation is that the United States is a free economy. I think we are one of the croniest capitalist economies on earth. I think this is definitely crony capitalism in this country, and it's certainly not a free market.
And it has been for a long time.
Yeah. Oh, certainly, definitely, for a long time.
In fact, Belloc takes the high ground and says you will actually always find cronyism once you find wealth
anywhere
concentrated at a certain.
You find cronyism. I mean, you find
no. He's not just talking about ordinary human corruption. He's saying that once wealth scales, the lines between the political and the economic just do blur. Whereas I think that the free marketeer wants to say, look, it's conceivable. I want a society where you can grow your business as big as you want it, as big as demand allows, and that's great.
I kind of dispute that too.
Continue.
Well, no restrictions should be placed in the way, so long as you're doing it honestly. You're not actually cheating anybody or something like that. You should be. There shouldn't be any disincentives, right? Okay.
Yeah.
It should be scaled as much as can be, and we should hope for a society where somebody reaches the economic pinnacle and then has his Cincinnatus moment, just goes back to cabbage farming. He doesn't stand at the top of all his financial power and say, hey, this could buy me favors, and this could buy me security personnel, and this could I could kind of get away with stuff that other people can't get away with. So they're not saying that money absolutely corrupts, but they are saying in the grand scheme of things that and they look at history. People like Belloc look at history and say, you have examples of people like Crassus, one of the three triumvirs, right? How did he get to be a triumvir? It wasn't because he was a great general like Pompey or Caesar. It's because he owned a boatload of silver mines and he could pay off a bunch of soldiers to advance his claim. So he said, look, there's always been this extra way to access political power, not just through the usual channels. And he furthermore says that he actually makes a stronger claim. He says, not only does this happen, but you will actually get a bigger state at the top if you allow business to reach a certain scale normally. If most businesses are allowed to reach international scale, then you better expect to find an international legislating body to govern them, because you always do need some kind of superstructure to guarantee trade, so that if somebody cheats or defaults, there's somebody who can hold them accountable. So as you scale businesses up, and we saw this in the US with interstate commerce exploitation, right? So as businesses get bigger, the federal government has to get bigger to remain an entity that can oversee them effectively. So those are the 2 points I'd want to make. One, that on behalf of Belloc, since he does make these points in servile state, at a certain point, what the his criticism of capitalism is that the capitalists want you to believe that it's possible to have a society where all of these very successful businessmen decide to play nice and not to enter the political sphere and seek, illegitimate advantage, in the market. He says that's a pipe dream. That's one of his claims. And another is that actually, as businesses scale, if enough of them reach a certain point in society, it will generate the need for more centralized government. So he thought big business and big government kind of go together. And the way to solve the problem is to try to overall, not in every single case, in every market, but in general, to scale down business so that we can also scale down government.
How?
Anyway.
How do we scale down business?
Well, one concrete proposal he did make, this is another one of the criticisms often thrown at distributists, is that they never had any concrete proposals. But they actually had quite a few. And Belloc, in his essay on the restoration of property, says, look, even in his day, grocery stores require licensing if they're going to pick up a new product.
Yeah.
Right? So say I'm a Walmart and I roll into town and I start with just, standard Walmart goods, and then I decide to become a super Walmart, so I tack on a grocery, and then I want to sell tobacco as well, so I get a tobacco license and so on. He said, what if, in the interest of encouraging more people to become entrepreneurs, his concern was to leave space for small capital to make inroads on some of these markets. What if we just make it prohibitively expensive through a kind of tax system for you to advance into market 5, 6, or 7? So like Walmart, you want to come in and you want to sell, I don't know, t-shirts and sweatpants and some groceries. All right, you're good for those 5 to 6 licenses that allow you to do that. But once you start getting to the 7th or 8th categories, you introduce some kind of penalty that discourages it, right? So that you're not encouraged to expand laterally. Maybe you reinvest some of your profits in the quality of your goods, or something like that, rather than going across them. And what his concern was, effectively nixing other people who are working in the same space. You just you reinvest money in the products that you're offering. So just one last thing, and then just have at me. But one way to understand them, I think, from somebody who comes from a pro free market background and still thinks that competition in markets is a very good thing. They wanted as many entrepreneurs as you could get. So their disagreement with a capitalist is not really about whether entrepreneurialism is good. It would be a waste of time to try to rebut the distributist by saying, look, entrepreneurialism is really great. They say, yeah, but we just disagree. We think that your approach actually discourages. It provides certain opportunities, not just through cronyism, but through what happens when capital scales. There are certain advantages that organizations get. We can talk about that just by having an accumulated amount of capital that has nothing to do with the product they're providing, but just how much they've already acquired. There are certain advantages that the large units have that the small units don't have, and they effectively crowd out. Whether it achieves like crazy monopoly, something from science fiction, that's a different story. But again, because their claim isn't that we need to make sure that all concentration of capital stops and we have an agrarian wonderland. They don't believe in that. That's more of a Marxist vision. But they just thought, putting some of these laws in place to discourage excessive concentration of specifically productive capital, what you use to make wealth, would translate into more entrepreneurs, would create more space for smaller units of capital to take the risk and actually have a plausible chance of success. So they're pro-entrepreneur. And I think that's something that at least a free marketeer should be sympathetic with.
Sure.
As end, not necessarily with their means.
I don't know anybody that disputes that, but yeah.
Well, okay. my only question is back to Goya. I would have opportunities to enter the market in different ways because I'm able to get such cheap goods from places like Walmart and Goya, right? I can get my produce and my meat pretty cheap. Not anymore, but I used to be able to anyway. And that frees me in a certain respect to engage the market wherever I want. Maybe I want to have a philosophy podcast and push that as far as I can, right? which I couldn't do if the only olives I could get were produced by some guy who made them by hand in his backyard, right? So there's
you might eat something different, right?
well, right, but that's just an example that I hope would sort of fill in for any number of different things. There's lots of goods. In fact, basically every good that I purchase is made in mass, right? Not by a small team of people. And the ones that I do try to get that are made by a small team of people, like our local Catholic-owned coffee shop, is 50% more. And I'm happy to support them, but it comes at a strain, And so if everything that I bought costed 50% more because it was being made on a smaller scale, like those advantages that the corporation has against other people trying to enter the market because they're bigger, those advantages also in a way trickle down to me, right? At least in the middle of their competition, and maybe even just for a time, I don't know, but they certainly do. Whereas if it wasn't possible for big businesses to manufacture things in mass and cheaply, I would find myself working my own company with my own means of production, perhaps, but working very hard and having a much lower standard of living, even along the way. That's the way it seems to me, anyway.
Well, one disagreement that I think, and this is seldom discussed explicitly, but I think it lurks beneath the surface. One disagreement between distributists and, say, classical liberal economists is that they disagree about what counts in the standard of living, right? I think that lurks in the background. Is ownership and control a part of your standard of living, or would it be, how much is that worth, say, compared to, and it's hard to reconcile these things, compared to having all of your basic needs met, right?
Yeah.
And I think that the distributists just place a much higher premium on having control at a lower level, and the average guy having more say in his job, and there being more people who could plausibly be self-employed. They say, look, that's just worth higher costs. So yeah, if you have a nation full of boutique, producers, and maybe things would be higher. I don't have any references for you, but I do know that I remember running across an article that disputed that once, and it was doing a case study on another country that actually, with the disappearance of some centralizing or some central producer, you actually saw cheaper goods. I don't know. At a certain point, I simply don't understand the inputs and outputs of economics. And I would also say, though, and I'd caution you against any, well, I've heard from enough other economists, I guess, and people who've read more economic theory than I do, that it seems like a lot of people claim to really know what's going on and don't about real economies. Yeah. It's easier to talk about ideal economies, like Phil was talking about earlier, about that, we don't live, what we live in is a very heavily mixed and messy economy. It's not the perfect, it's not an unrestricted free market. So it's easier to talk about the ideals, harder to talk about just what exactly makes eggs so stinking expensive or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know enough to even have a fruitful conversation about that, but I know that has been disputed, at least, that there's more to the picture, that there's a kind of reset that takes place in an economy when, say, a single large producer steps out of the picture and a bunch of small guys come in. But it probably depends on the particular market too, right? And the good in question.
It has a lot to do with it.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. I've been talking a lot.
Julian, I had one other follow-up, but I know you had questions more of a practical nature as to teaching the material. Did you have anything you wanted to say?
Did you want me to answer the practical question? Because I think I can't. My school was really tolerant of people taking critical views of distributism. I don't know that the Chesterton Schools Network they're not dogmatic distributists, but they think that you ought to at least say something about Rerum Novarum and what it was trying to do, and the history of Catholic social teaching. And in general, they don't, by Catholic social teaching, they don't mean crypto-Marxism, right? Which is what it does mean, unfortunately, in too many places. They just mean rerum novarum, what Chesterton and Belloc tried to do in England, because they will have read a bunch of.
Have you ever read? Have you read this?
Oh, I'm familiar with Novak. Yeah, I don't think I've read the whole thing, but yeah.
Okay. He's got a number of works that I have here, but okay, I was just curious.
Yeah. But long story short, for Julian's practical question, knowing the Chesterton Schools Network, I think you're expected to present it, and that's fine, but you're not necessarily going to, you don't have to require full compliance with some kind of dogma.
It actually seems like it'd be a really good senior level course, because a lot of the students would probably have some idea about what they think fair means in the marketplace, right? And so confronting them and really inviting a debate in the classroom could be really good senior level material.
Yeah.
Some of this boils down to knowing the particular personalities at Chesterton. I don't think anybody would be gung ho. I think the most you'd be expected to say is just, look, the church has definitely said some, in recent years in particular, has said negative things about socialism and communism, lots of negative things. And I said fewer negative things, but has also critiqued Western markets. Boom, you're done.
But not in the same order either.
No, socialism more, but
not more as in a matter of degree. Like
no.
the condemnation of socialism and communism is different in kind from their cautions about capitalism.
Yeah.
But
yes, because socialism aspires to abolish property altogether, which runs afoul of nature directly rather than. Well, I don't know. Leo says some pretty. We could go passage by passage on this. Leo says some pretty strong stuff about the right of a farmer, a tenant farmer, to the land that he works. Pretty challenging stuff for a capitalist, and because he also grounds that in the claim of nature.
Yeah, no, this is true, and I know we're talking about a practical matter too, so I'll back out. But like one of the first things I'd really want to do is define capitalism. Because capitalism is a Marxist term, and it also admits of many definitions.
Yeah,
and I'm not really sure what we're talking about here, because one of the things that's really funny when I talk to capitalists and distributists is that because they kind of hate each other, but the distributists, as much as I love to be polemical against them, if I'm being fair to them, that's the heart of capitalism, like the mom and pop. Individual ownership of means of production as widely distributed as possible, that kind of competition of being like, that's the heart of real capitalism, and it kind of makes people's heads explode. But I know we're talking about school curricula right now, so I'll.
Well, I mean, the curriculum stuff and the practical stuff is grounded in the theory, so that
true, but
happy to hear out all of the other things.
To your point, Phil, I have heard PragerU and Ben Shapiro talk about the praises of big business and using the same sort of terms that I used when I was raising objection against Evan. That's basically where I'm getting it from, because I know that's the objection that's out there, is that these big businesses make life easier, making it easier.
Then they do. Certainly.
Things, right?
Yes, absolutely. Certainly they do. I also tend to think, and this was born of,
well, sometimes they don't, right?
True, but like in general, when you're just talking about
make things artificially very expensive.
When you're talking though about just sheer an economy of scale, Walmart can provide things, my groceries and my shirts and whatever, generally cheaper than my mom and pop down the corner. That's just generally true, right? But I think, and again, I don't really want to go down the rabbit hole on this unless y'all want to. I've been wondering about, one of the things I wonder about is whether or not there's a natural limit. This is what I kind of bucked on a little bit earlier. Evan, when you were talking about just somebody growing their business as big as they want to. That was kind of the way you phrased it. I know you were speaking colloquially too. But I actually wonder whether or not there's a natural, a kind of limit to the size of how big your business can grow. And somebody asked me this when I was presenting my paper at the ACPA last year, and I've kind of been thinking about it a little bit more. One, there have been studies that have shown, right, that the larger your business is, like Amazon is a hugely inefficient company. Because the owner, he's got no idea. He doesn't even know what the divisions of his company, all the different divisions of Amazon, what they do, what they work on, what markets they're in. He has no idea. And therefore, he's actually not able to make really informed decisions regarding the activities of all those divisions because he's got no idea what they do because it's just too big.
Well, that doesn't necessarily mean inefficient.
Well, it is inefficient because when you're not able to make decisions with accurate information based on what those divisions are doing.
Efficiency doesn't necessarily mean that the toppest dog makes the decisions. Efficiency precisely could include delegation.
True, but there have been other, and that's one of the things I was looking for this week, and I'm still looking, but I know I've read them. There have been studies in some of the economic journals about that mid-level management, about how they make companies inefficient, precisely because they're not really answerable to anybody.
They're bullshit jobs.
Exactly.
That's the technical term.
That's where the top down breaks up.
It is the technical
fully
term.
Separates from the bottom up.
Yeah.
Right. And so so the larger a company gets past a certain point, and again, this is it's hard to draw that line, like what's the definitive line, because there really isn't one. But at a certain point for each owner, you lose track of what your company's doing, and middle management doesn't solve that problem for you. And that seems to introduce a problem for just how large can your company get. I forget why I started going down that road.
I just don't see that as a problem. I just don't understand why it's a problem if I don't know everything. Like, I'm not the one who has to make all the decisions. I say, you're going to oversee this field. I don't need to know how many rows of wheat you have planted in it.
Sure.
Right? Just get it done and bring me the bottom line.
It does get to be your problem then if you don't know how many rows of wheat there are, and the manager that you've hired who isn't responsible to the owner, and you have no idea of whether or not what he's telling you is true, and he's just overseeing your workers, right? That is a problem for you.
Yeah, I think what Phil's saying is that the business starts to suffer simply from a lack of top-down fail-safes. That's why the managers exist, to say something starts going sideways. It's the manager's competence to reallocate resources. But suppose something's going sideways and he's just not even tuned in enough to make the snap judgment that's required to change course. That's going to result in real cost. And I think, Phil, you're saying that's kind of an inherent failsafe against a business scaling too big.
I think so. Like, I haven't worked this out all the way, but it is something I think about, that there does seem to be some sort of limit on how large your business can get before you really do start. If you want to talk about your business is here to make profits, there comes a point where you might not be making as much profits as you should, and you've got no idea.
Yeah, but so this is what I'm thinking. I'm a CEO, and I've got my board of
trustees,
let's say. They're coming to me and they're bringing their reports on the different parts of my multi-industry corporations.
That's not what the board of trustees does. But.
Well, then I'm talking about something else. I want to know, like, whoever the guy is, and I'm getting the general reports of all of my heads of
the division,
whatever departments I've got.
Your vice presidents.
Yeah. All right, let's say I'm the president. These are my vice presidents then. All right, it doesn't matter. But so I'm getting these reports, and I'm getting a report about my wheat production. I'm like, that's not the expected profit margin that I thought I was going to get based on my look on the market when I first told you to invest in wheat and figure it out, right? Oh, that wasn't as profitable as I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
Exit, right?
Okay.
Like, especially when it's compared with the other divisions of your company, when you're like, wow, my wheat industry is really doing really poorly, whereas my coal miners, I'm making tons of profit on these guys. I'm going to pull resources from wheat and put them into coal, right? So
can I jump in here, Phil?
Yeah.
Phil's response, I think, would be that he was talking about accountability. You sitting at the top, you don't know whether your wheat yield is as good as you think it is. It just becomes a situation where deception is easy and accountability is too little.
Wait.
That's the thing. The middle manager isn't accountable to
how are they gonna they're gonna fudge the paperwork? Is that what you're saying? Like
or
my
just fail
bank
to
account?
report something in time. Yeah, I mean, and what's lost practically in a fast moving business is you lose a lot of efficiency, which results in actual cost and loss of profit margins. So I think he's just saying, look, every business has to deal with some, not even necessarily malicious actors, but people who just aren't doing their job well.
Sure.
And if the middle manager happens to be one of those people, then your link to the guys on the ground doing the work as the one who calls the shots is broken.
Yeah.
Or if a whole office, if a whole area isn't doing well, but everybody's looking out for number one and they're saying, we don't want to report this necessarily. We're not anxious to let our bosses know that we're not meeting quota. So we don't. And then there's nobody to actually make sure that the information is provided to the right.
I just don't see a way that this trickles upward to a point where the top dog can't make a decision unless the bottom line is being lied about, unless bank deposit notes are being falsified or something, right? There's just got to be a way you could just look at the ledger and be like, well, these profit margins aren't what I was hoping they would be. And I think that would be the measure, right? Because this is the way investors are thinking, right? They're not thinking, I just want to make profit on my wheat and I want to make as much profit as possible. They're thinking, if I can't make as much profit on wheat as I can on coal, I'm going to move my resources from wheat to coal, right? Mm-hmm. Something like that. So if I'm thinking about it that way, all I've got to look at is bottom line profitability. I don't need to look at every step in the chain. I just need to know if the reports are coming back in a way that I expected them to come back, more or less, right? And then I can make a decision on simple information. There may be inefficiencies in that big system.
Well, but the point Evan's right. The point also that I was trying to make, though, is that those inefficiencies affect the information you're getting.
They can't affect the ledger, the bank deposit note, right?
It
can make it worse than it should be.
Well, absolutely, they could, right? This depends on. Yeah.
I mean, there's no major corporation that deals in cash, man. They don't get a ledger that represents a determinate amount of. I mean, we're talking about fast moving large sums of money, a lot of which is credit, right? So, in that, I don't know. I think what you're envisioning is a little bit too simple. That there's some one place that a person could go to get the actual account of what's going on.
Well, it's probably not one place, right? But I can't imagine it being so complicated that I could.
Well, the issue is when there are many places, and you have to take stock of a whole bunch of different places to make the machine run. That's where the risk of system-wide error creeps in. So I think what Phil's saying is just in the nature of scaling, there are these inherent risks. Chesterton actually uses, to go back to a distributist, Chesterton uses the image of an assembly line to talk about the risks of centralization. He says, look, okay, an assembly line making books is way more efficient than 20 guys sitting down hand copying them. But when the assembly line breaks, the 20 guys are far more efficient. If 25% of your assembly line shuts down, the whole thing shuts down. Whereas if 25% of your copyists call in sick, the other 15 keep going. Right. And he said, so there's a kind of resilience built into decentralization that you don't see when you've centralized. And that's the inefficiencies of bureaucracy only exist at scale. If you know the guy that you need to go to get the answer, and it's one of two people, that makes a huge difference. If it's a whole forest of people or a whole department, then information can be lost so much more easily.
So I guess what we're imagining is something like where a low-level manager doesn't meet his quota that his upper level manager is checking for, and he doesn't meet it because he's got some employee or some Stragum employees who aren't doing well that he didn't catch, right? He didn't terminate and replace quickly enough. And so he knows that he could just go and try to blame this on the low level guy, but that his upper level manager is not going to be happy with it. So instead he covers it up somehow and says, oh, well, this happened and that it's just a total lie, and the upper level manager doesn't check, and so that problem just sort of stays in the system, and then it doesn't ever go corrected, or
yeah, at minimum, it's just that the resources of the attention resources of a manager are finite. He can't focus on everything, and the more complex you make his management task, the less attention he can give to particular things. So maybe he sees the ledger, but there's just so much information. The ledger here, which is spreadsheets upon spreadsheets upon spreadsheets of all kinds of things. If he's not able to read that attentively, then
but you couldn't, even in the best of circumstances.
Right. But the point is that not that the top dog would look at the entire ledger, but that he would look at summaries, so to speak, of sections of the ledger, and each summary would be looked at more closely by a manager beneath him, and of that, each section of that ledger would be reviewed by another smaller manager, down to the guy who's writing the line items in, right? So I'm trying to just understand the failure in the chain here and how this subsists, right?
Well, in writing a summary, and that's summarizing is a part of what you do in a managerial position. But when you summarize, you leave things out, and if you're incompetent, you leave the wrong things out, right? That's and you include the stuff you don't need to include.
You would also.
So it doesn't need to be malice.
Yeah, that's true.
Sure.
It doesn't have to be malice, right? It could be. Doesn't have to be. You can leave out the fact that
you're far more vulnerable if you scale. If the manager's attention is too divided, or it's just impossible for him to actually do all the work he needs to do to find out the real answers. There are
too many things involved for prudential action.
All right. So then, what I'm thinking is that there's not a natural limit here, because anytime there's going to be oversight by oversight, then there's going to be the room for this mistake.
Yeah, I'm stretching what I mean by a natural limit.
Yeah,
it's true.
It just seems like it's going to be a question of, is it still profitable to grow one further level of management upward, right, or not? And the answer in general, it's usually yes, right? There's still more profits to be had, even though there's more inefficiencies.
Well, that's the thing. Like, profitability isn't the be all end all. In a certain sense, right?
In the absolute sense, it's not.
Well, but even if I'm going after profits, right? My goal is to make as much profit as I can be. And the fact of the matter is that I reach a certain point where I'm not sure that I'm making as much profit as I can be anymore.
But you're sure that you're making more profit than you would be if you cut out the entire industry of your corporation.
So then I could be otherwise.
Your management down a deck.
Sure. But then that's the thing about prudential action. Like, do I really even know what I'm doing? I might be making a shit ton of money, and I have no idea why, right?
It's great, man. America.
Go ahead, Evan. Go ahead.
So I think this all stemmed, if I'm not mistaken, from Belloc's proposal that I just mentioned. And by the way, this was actually taken up in a number of places, including a market that's been studied pretty extensively, which is the German market after World War II, that rebuilt incredibly quickly. It wasn't sure, it was exchanging goods with markets which we already know Phil would not recognize to be radically free, unrestricted markets, already pretty compromised. But this was a consciously kind of third way approach that took some cues. And I think I have a book here that talks about that, about the development of the German market economy and some of its influences. It took some cues from distributism. So one of the charges is that distributism is quixotic. It's this farm life for everybody, fairyland idea that leaves ultimately all of us quite poor, and they don't have any practical proposals. But in fact, some of their key ideas were picked up explicitly in the Germany after the war, which went from a market that was nearly zero to the strongest market in Europe in only a few decades, which is a crazy turnaround.
Yeah.
So that's why it's been studied so intensely. But they use some of these same policies. So whatever you call them, it seems like there's some value in encouraging people to have a community to have a share, say, in a business, not letting it rise or scale too high even for efficiency's sake, because of the loss of efficiency that Phil was talking about, and ultimately the loss of you even lose some quality in the goods given to the consumer.
Right.
So sometimes free markets are praised for the variety of choices, not just how cheap, but just how many options that you're given. But if I've got a choice between a dozen different shit sandwiches, I'm still not going to eat one, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. I don't care. You say, well, next week we'll have 24, and the week after that 48, and it's just going to keep going. So I'm still not interested. No, thank you. So I think so to define capitalism, because that was something that Phil said that I think is also really important. Because from where I sit, I've seen people who start with distributism, and then they kind of go off into further extreme, like leftist stuff, right? And I think the problem is that they're defining themselves oppositionally against capitalism, and that's a moving target. So they're going to back into all kinds of weird stuff if they do that. The movement that Chesterton and Belloc created was a pretty time-sensitive movement. It was a response to the English market at their time, late 19th century England, which had some pretty famously bad working conditions. And it was a pretty experimental economy, and there was a lot of lost efficiency. There was extreme risk to some of the people who worked in manufacturing. It's just the way it was. So to say that they're critics of capitalism in any conceivable form or anything that wears the name would be crazy. So I think if a Chesterton were to hear you say, Phil, that the heart of capitalism is the mom and pop shop and the family-owned business, then I think he'd say, then call me a capitalist, right? But it still wouldn't move. It wouldn't move the goalpost, or it wouldn't move the ball forward, so to speak. Yeah. We'd just be moving the goalposts around.
Yeah, that's why at least in my writings, I try to avoid capital. I try to avoid the phrase capitalism as much as I can. I prefer, if I'm going to talk about it, a market-based, insofar as that means anything, a market-based economy.
Right. What's the contrast class to a market-based economy? Control, like state control.
Yeah. Anything that's centrally and.
Yeah. So any market economy always has parameters defined by a state somewhere, right?
Absolutely.
The rules of the game are always set.
Absolutely.
By a state.
Yeah. Sure.
That's a very broad term, though. Like Julie and I were watching.
There are different kinds of markets too.
Julie and I were watching a documentary about Mao's China and how the Chinese came out of that, and they were saying, I mean, I've not researched any further than this, but they were saying that the way they got out of the famines in the countryside was by opening up the markets again, so that people could bring their cows in the market and just sell them.
Yeah.
Right. That's. Would you call that a free market?
It's interesting the way you it's interesting even the way you describe that, right? They had to open up the markets again so that you could just bring your goods and sell them to people that were willing to buy.
Yeah, well, the point is.
But that's the heart of a truly free market exchange is that anybody that has something to sell to someone who wants to buy it, and they are uncoerced as to who they can sell to or who they can buy from, right? I mean, that's just the heart of. I mean, that's just exchange.
I'm just trying to be clear that.
Yeah.
Do you mean by your free market economy to include markets like the Chinese, where certain corporations may be owned by the government, but nonetheless people are still able to bring their cow into the market and sell it? I don't know what the current Chinese market is.
Can I just jump in and say something about this related to distributism again? Just a lot of people fault distributism for being too short on some kind of for not having a boilerplate that allows them to just generate policy after policy. But I guess in fairness, you could say the same thing about people who support free markets and freer markets, right? They're not. If a proponent of market-driven solutions says, "Look, there's a point. I mean, not everything needs to be turned over to the market, right? Some things, like the military, probably shouldn't be just handed over to the free market." Crassus disagrees, but So there are some things that shouldn't be, some things that should. But overall, I think the free marketeer spends much of his life advocating for fewer restrictions in the market. And in the same way, it wouldn't be a fair charge against distributists that much of their platform was, look, we just want more of this. There are certain boundaries and certain restrictions we accept. We're not going to push this to the hilt or try to make this into some kind of end-all be-all principle, but we just think society would be better off if we passed policy that pushed further in this direction. So again, what you're saying, Joe, is that you could call China, which has elements of market and certainly makes use of international market economies within their own domestic economy, a free market or capitalist society, if the presence of any exchange of the kind that Phil was talking about, because you can have that in limited domains within particular markets, right?
Sure.
If that's the hallmark of capitalism or a market-driven economy, then how much do you need in order to pass the muster? I think.
Yeah, that's the question.
Joe's thrust.
Right.
So Evan, to try to rephrase what you just said, the distributist doesn't think that it's necessarily better that more parameters on the market, the better. He just thinks that were there more parameters on the current market, it would be better for society as a whole.
I think that's in a way not the way they would think of it. They think that you need the reestablishment of laws and rules that were at one point customary in places like England. Again, I only know how to talk about these two distributists whose work I know, and Belloc between the two was the more systematic. And what he would say is what happened in the generation. He critiques the history of capitalism. I'll get around to your question. I'm not going on a tangent here, but he says it's a mistake to think that the assembly line or that technology popped into existence and then boom, centralized production. He says what happened was a series of really important economic shifts in the English economy leading up to those economic advances or those technological advances, right? He says it's entirely conceivable that we could have had a technological discovery that would have benefited the yeoman farmer. But the fact is that the yeoman farmer ceased to exist, not because of technological discovery that affected economics, but because of certain things like Charles II's requiring that all farmers have documented evidence of ownership to their land, and then consequent seizure of that land from people who'd squatted or people who'd worked it for generations. You have things like the monastic seizure of land under Henry VIII, and then an English aristocracy that suddenly owned most of the means of production. Like 70% of the arable land in England was concentrated into the friend group of Henry VIII, into their hands, right? And I mean, that's centuries before the Industrial Revolution. But he says those were the kinds of legal things that happened. And you also had breaking of local laws. You had things like a lot of local level prohibitions of things like child labor that were overturned in the 19th century run up to industrialism as we know it. So what he would say is we want to kind of try to return not to some state in the past, but to, you might say, a legal condition where, and a cultural condition where the default presumption in economics is to do what favors citizen business owners, and not to set up laws and then for the government to somewhat retreat. And that might seem a little quixotic, but I guess what I would say is it's no less quixotic than the expectation that you could have the government retreat when the economic stakes are extremely high, when you have mega corporations. Although I think Phil's suggesting that perhaps the only reason that large companies achieve the scale they do is because of state intervention. Is that step number 2?
Let me say that again. Like,
So you were saying that there are these internal.
That the only reason the only reason they get as large as they do is because of state intervention?
If there's an internal state destabilizing element, is it only because they start to
I think, well, at least
on the teat of the government?
To your point about economies in practice, I think that's right. Like here where I live, one of the reasons I have to pay so much for my internet is because Antietam broadband is in the pocket of the government, and they have monopoly on
because it's tied to land.
providing the internet service to all of this block, and right. And so the reason, and so there's no competition that's allowed against them. And so
let me give you an example of the way that a one-time state intervention can actually generate more competition. It's not always to the opposite, right?
No. And this is the problem too. And I think sometimes both the capitalists and the distributists will fall into this trap. Is you're trying to systematize something. You're trying to universalize something that is always going to be a particular action for a particular time and place, a particular market, or a particular product, or whatever, right? So, but so go ahead.
So, I guess an answer, Julian, to what you were asking, their vision would be to scale down not only. So it's not that they're saying we need these restrictions or we need like state interventions in market to exist indefinitely. They say, look, going back, you had mores, you had customs that often just kept this stuff from happening. It just didn't occur to people in a lot of places to take the kinds of steps that people regularly take now. And so you're ignoring some of the differences just culturally between the past and present if you suppose that the only reason, say, that somebody didn't become a tycoon in the 15th century was because he lacked the opportunity or he lacked the technology. Right. And they want a society that scales back, and then in a sense, the state takes its hands off. They want a small state and a small scale economy. And part of the point I made earlier about Belloc is he thinks that's the only way you're actually going to get one or the other. That unless you have decentralization in economics, it's the only way to get a smaller, less centralized authoritarian government.
Yeah.
So I guess
which is kind of funny. That's one of my critiques of the distributists.
My question then is like, because custom has the force of law, right? So, where the customs became lost, do they then just need to be supplemented by laws from the state?
I think his contention would be that you need laws to exist for a time to kind of re-educate people. And then it becomes culture after a while. You can see all kinds of examples. I mean, just the presumed rights that we have, it's not necessarily because, there's a general sense of what rights you have and what ought not to be done to you as an American citizen that isn't just a factor of your having picked up some legal book at some point or another, right? It's baked in. And it's just unthinkable in some respects that it could be otherwise. And that's the result of law existing for a long time, and it's trickling down, and it didn't always exist. So I think his idea, let me give you an example of something that distributists critique. And I know some latter-day self-described distributists critique this, and I think it's an interesting point. So when women entered the workforce, in the early 20th century, this is before World War II and Rosie the Riveter and all that stuff, right? This is roaring 20s, I think. Push for women to enter the workforce. Up until that time, the employee pool that you had to work with was entirely men. And the standard culturally was that you pay a man enough that he'd be able to take care of at least, himself and a couple family members, sustain all of their, meet all of their needs. That was just a cultural presumption that I couldn't attract an employee to me unless I offered this kind of wage for even entry-level production jobs, right? And I think in the auto industry, Ford was well known for actually visiting his employees' houses to check to make sure that they weren't, his employees, even his line guys, weren't blowing their paychecks on booze, that they were actually taking care of their families. And that was, you might say, just a custom that had the force of law. It wasn't something that was imposed top down, but everybody understood that when you pay a man for work, if it's not an odd job, I mean, if it's a year-round renewing position, then it's something that should allow him to take care of a family, not just himself. So the dual income situation that we have now for families to meet their needs, and in a lot of cases, it really is a matter of meeting needs. It's not just a matter of superfluous vacation spending or something. For entry-level jobs, the dual income economy we have now is a result of women entering the workforce when one party, I don't remember how exactly this played out chronologically, but one automobile manufacturer said, look, you have all these women now who are agitating to get jobs. I can pay them less. And they'll come work for me. And they're probably going to do work that's maybe a little worse. They'll probably do equivalent work, but they'll accept less pay. And then what that did across the whole market is it drove the wages of men down, because it cut into the cultural presumption that when you pay a man a year-round salary, or when you pay a man a wage with a view to a whole year's worth of work.
I dispute that was because it cut into a cultural expectation.
Wait, hold on, let me finish.
But go ahead.
That you were paying for his whole family, and then children enter the workforce too. I mean, children were very cheap, easy. I mean, they worked for very little. And surely, here's something. Surely the paying of children for a time drove the cost of goods down, right? Goods produced, because labor was suddenly far cheaper than the men that were previously paid to do the job. But at what cost? And it's those kinds of things that really drove the distributists crazy. They said, if this is what an unrestricted market looks like, kids spending their childhood in a textile mill, then it's not good for the child, ultimately, who has to grow up and become one of these consumers you're so concerned about, right? So we're damaging the child to grow up to be a consumer who can buy cheap stuff, yes, but who's now having to work from home to help family pay the bills, or not work from home, but who's having to work when he's in the home to help his family pay the bills. So one of their criticisms is and it sounds kind of Marxist, is that they were making goods cheaper, but they could effectively, because of these kinds of forces, like more of the family members entering the workforce, dad's salary went down, so that all kind of came out even for them for a time. If you're looking at an individual family, like how much money making they were doing over the course of like 10 to 20 years, or actual purchasing power they had, stayed even though more people were now working outside of the home. That doesn't make much sense. You see what I mean? Because the cost of goods were going down, but then, you also had to meet other expenses that weren't fluctuating quite as much, and dad's salary went down to compensate for the cost of goods going down. Does that make sense? Anyway, that's a point of recurrent criticism in distributist literature, and it is something that did happen, although Phil has a different idea about exactly what forces were in play.
Probably.
Go ahead.
Well, you said you had something different, a different opinion.
I don't dispute the conclusion. I think I dispute the way you phrased the cause when you were just talking about that, or that the way that it cut into some sort of cultural expectation. And to me, this is just it's the principle of marginal utility at work, right? When you have a ton of women entering the workforce, and all of a sudden my workers, the pool that I can draw from is double. I have way more workers. I have basically double the amount of workers than I used to have, right? They're less valuable to me as an employer than when I had only half the population. They're more valuable. And then all of a sudden you flood that market with laborers. Labor is going to become a lot cheaper.
So maybe another middle term between...
But the conclusion is the same.
One recurrent complaint, though, that a distributist would have with that way of thinking about it is that principle is nothing more than the aggregate choices of individual people, right?
Yeah. Marginal utility.
And they'd also say this is a net loss. The distributists also thought, in general, it was better for there to be homemakers. So now, but once enough people have made this choice, suddenly it's harder for dad to get the kind of position that allowed him to pay for mom.
Sure, but that's just what's going to happen when you double the labor market. Labor is going to become less expensive.
Well, right. So the distributists would say, look, just put a law in place to stop that. Like the cultural prejudice,
sure, that's a different presumption.
Broke
that's
down.
the conclusion. I think what Phil's saying is
I'm not arguing that
there's a middle term in between. Yeah. You said like the culture changed, and then that led to this conclusion. I think what Phil is saying is that flooding the market with labor led to the culture change.
That's all I was disputing.
Oh, gotcha. Well, no. It's a little bit of both, though. That they were I was trying to point out that there were some staunch there were some men who insisted on only hiring factory men and limited themselves deliberately to the pool and then could not compete.
Oh, sure. But
right?
that's going to be the position they find themselves in.
Yeah.
Because the market value of labor is just it's lower. And so if they only want to hire men, I mean, that's going to be the position they find themselves in.
Every other factory would be able to undercut them.
Here's what I'm getting at, though. Whether they counted as labor was a matter of human choice. And for the longest time, they just weren't. And it took a few people first to say, whoa, we can widen our margins.
A few women. Or wait. Where does it start? Does it start with the women who want jobs, or does it start with employers?
It starts with feminism from the bottom up, but also businesses who took them up on it because they saw what they could get out of the equation. Okay.
Yeah,
and that violated norms that weren't necessarily written into law. But what it did is it also created pressure on the rest of the market. So I guess I am trying to describe the cultural forces that went into that expansion of the labor force, which then acted the way Phil said it.
Okay.
So I'm just insisting it's not some kind of impersonal law of economics that had to play out this way. People chose.
Sure, but I think
what I'm said we don't agree with the other guys who say
the only thing what I'm counter proposing is that there is that impersonal law that given those choices, this was how it was going to play out. The law of marginal utility is the first principle of economics following from human action. If I act for some end, and in intending the end, I intend the means to that end, the means are valuable insofar as they get me to the end, and excess means beyond that are less valuable. Insofar as, unless I can direct them to some other sort of end. This is a starting point.
Sure.
So
given general diminishing returns, right.
Given those choices that you've described, and I'm not disputing that, right? Given those choices, this is how it was going to play out.
Yeah. Okay, I think it's where that language creeps in that I don't.
Evan always gets so close to just.
Given that the feminists were going to win, and given that some business owners made that decision, and that other consumers said we're going to take what's cheaper.
I'm not saying that. Yeah, I'm not saying it was
might be better for society overall.
I'm not saying that it was right or that it was better for society overall. I'm saying that in a market, once labor becomes cheaper, I mean that's where you're going.
I think you guys agree with each other. I don't think I can't see a disagreement between what either you were saying.
Yeah. Well, we might talk about just economic laws in general, though, because there's a peculiar way that theorists in the classical liberal school talk about economic laws that does get under my skin, and seems to leaves out of consideration the deliberative elements. Because all things.
I think the laws of economics precisely follow from the deliberative element of human action.
Well, I think there are lots of places where, one classic example that violates classical modeling of economic choice, right? The presumption is that if cost of a good increases, then desire or demand for that good will decrease proportionally, right? That doesn't happen when the cost is an index of the value of the good, and this is relevant.
That's right. Yeah, right.
To even labor markets where, like, the cost of when you go grocery shopping and you haven't necessarily done your independent research on which wines are best, you look at the price tags, right?
Yeah,
because it's like, oh, this is a $2 bottle of wine. I don't have any independent knowledge about whether this is good wine, but I know it's not going to be as good as the $10. That's where price is actually it's determining demand in a way that is simply not really accounted for by the classical models.
I don't know about that, but I do see the point you're trying to make.
And I'm saying that,
but there's a certain point that
increasingly uneasy because there are all these little cases.
But if you're assuming though that all of those wines are of equal value, then I think you might be in error, right?
I'll tell you what. Whenever I buy a $30 bottle of wine, I was
going to say Joe is the master of. Joe is
That's fine. That's fine. That's good. But you're also a more rational consumer, right? Then the other.
I feel like most people, when they buy something that's expensive and they really don't think it was worth the money, they remember, like, oh, that was bad, and they tell people about it. I bought this, like, I hate to use the example on here, but Jefferson's Oceans, which we had the pleasure to try, very expensive, and just did not live up to it. And we all talked about how it just couldn't quite make the cut worth the price,
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. But when you think about all of the economic decisions that you make, even in like the span of a week, this is another point of criticism with the, and this is more theoretical. Classical economic theory relies on the idealized, not only the idealized market situation, but also the idealized rational consumer. We say that the fully rational, not that they think it actually exists. Mises is clear about that, right?
Yeah.
There's probably not going to be one, but
Yeah.
But we want to create. It's in his interest. It's in the fully rational consumer's interest that we create cheaper goods, because he's the one who's going to be able to best avail himself of the situation.
I would completely agree, I'm sure, Evan, with all of your critiques of like the rational consumer, the Homo economicus. Like, there's not a, even the guys that I follow, there's not a free market capitalistic, at least again, the thinkers that I follow, all of them would have problems with what you're describing, the classical model of the rational consumer, the economical man, like none of that, all of those are insufficient for actually accounting for economic behavior or human behavior. And just as a real quick aside, this doesn't really fit in our discussion, but it is a paradigm shift. It's one of the things that, like, so Evan, you've raised this term, and I'm not imputing anything to your thought. It's just, this is a term I've heard from you all night about the idea of the person as consumer. And this is one of the things that always happen, whether, Marxist, capitalist, like a lot of economic systems of thought, this is one of my big problems with all of them, is that they tend to reduce the human person to just consumer, right? When you look at the human person as rational animal, and more from a theological perspective as created in the image and likeness of a creative God, the human person can, and I might even argue, depending on how you look at it, should be seen more as capable of production, right? Than just consumption.
Yeah.
And that's one of any economic system that looks at the person just as a consumer, then you've already lost something.
Right.
And that goes for capitalism as well, right?
That's a drum that distributists bang big time, specifically that series of points. Again, because it's largely a Catholic phenomenon. And it's explicitly Catholic in its principles. So it starts with those kinds of recognitions that a man may be a laborer, but he's more than a laborer. He's a man first, right? Or a man may consume, but he's more than a consumer. And it's part of that.
Is it really wrong to consider him under the ratio of consumer when that's the relevant ratio of the science?
That's the point. I'd say that's the point of contention. Is I don't think that's the ratio under which man is considered in economics.
No, producer and consumer, but also
this is where Aristotle starts, right? The whole purpose of krematistike and oikonomike is production for the sake of the needs, the material needs of a well-lived life, right? It's how you acquire or produce that which is needed for human flourishing. The actual beginning point of economics, I would argue, is from the purpose of production.
I haven't read as much economics as you guys, but when I hear
this is even where Aristotle starts, right?
I hear that baked into it. When I hear the consumer, I don't think of a guy who's just shoveling his face full of tacos or ice cream, but I think of the guy who's taking and using for the human life, right? And I don't know that maybe economists mean something different, but I don't know.
Well, one of the reasons the distributists would harp on a society that's characterized. Well, I mentioned earlier they have a peculiar conception of property, right? They distinguish between productive property and property that's maybe you hold in some sense, but think of the difference between a homeowner and a man who perpetually rents. One has sufficient income to pay the bills, and he's always renting, right? I speak from experience, but the distributists say that a man who owns, not only does he have the right to sell, but there are other almost spiritual goods that seem to come with that kind of ownership, a certain kind of pride that comes with taking hold and making it your own, rather than just, even if the use of the good might look outwardly to be no different. Like, you can't walk by and necessarily say that's a rented house, that's an owned house, right? The distributists would insist that there's something ennobling about a man really owning the place that he lives in, really owning the land that he lives on, rather than just renting it. And they said, so that's kind of their starting point. And they'd say, would it be better if we had a society that was characterized, and they're looking at England of their day, where you have lots of like low skilled laborers living in these like tenement housing, right? It's kind of squalid, and they're all renting. Nobody owns anything, really. They moved off the farm to get a job in the city, and this is the condition they find themselves in. They have nothing to hand on to their kids when they're done renting, right? It goes back to the landlord. So they said, look, if these are your options, this is, and they're not saying that in a capitalist economy, the capitalist economy, which they characterize as capitalist in their day. So just with a grain of salt, Bill, whatever it meant for the people who defended capitalism against them at the time, I guess radically unrestricted markets and whatever produced this condition. Even if it wasn't radically unrestricted, their whole point is, wouldn't it be better to have a society that's characterized more by wide ownership than by a bunch of renters? And isn't it conceivable that we would lose some efficiency in the process and even pay more for goods?
Sure.
But wouldn't we get back? Wouldn't we get in exchange more spiritual goods that are?
That's the thing, right? And so this is there's a lot that's involved here, and so maybe I'll just hit out some highlights and we can see what happens, right? Sure. So there are two things. One, I sort of dispute the caricatured version of the distributists to saying, yeah, we'd be paying higher prices for this, but we'd be spiritually, but we'd be much more moral people. And I'm not sure that that's entirely the case, but there is the distinction, real distinction to be made, Evan, and you did bring it up, right? The capitalist seems to reduce the human good to only the material good, and clearly that's not the case, right? There's, again, as we've said, there's more to being human than just the material.
Is that what's read under the ratio of consumer, like just material good?
I think so, perhaps. Okay. It certainly could be, right? Sure. That you're only looking out for just like your standard of living, considered in terms of material goods.
Okay,
right?
good.
I think it's a mistake to look for a hard and fast ratio in some of this, Joe, because as I tried to point out, this is cultural criticism and social criticism, really. Mm-hmm. Like capitalism doesn't have an essence, as we pointed out, or I mean, maybe it does, but we haven't even settled on
we're still using we're still using the term, and
but the way that it's commonly used, we're referring to something that's has some.
Yeah,
you might say a cluster of related meanings, but there's no single meaning.
All right, well, fair enough. Okay.
And to the point too about the notion of so just as a historical fact, and this is something I can't speak to because I didn't live through the period and I've not well studied on this period at all. But if the notion of so Thomas is clear on this, right? Human beings only act when they perceive some good for themselves, right? Otherwise they wouldn't do whatever, right? And the fact of the matter is that during the industrial period, people left their idyllic farms in swarms to go into London or to go into the cities to work at these factories and to live in these so-called squalid conditions. And I mean, you do need to ask at least, well, why? I mean, unless they really thought they were going to be better off than in their countryside living.
And I think we can assume that they were not betrayed. Like they got there and they're like, oh, this is where I'm living. Oh, this is what I'm doing. Like surely word got around what the cities were like.
Well, there's a fairly significant body of literature that voiced exactly that concern, right? But
well, just and I get it, and I know, like,
it's not also they weren't also coming from before we skew the picture too much. They weren't necessarily coming from the idols. Right? They weren't necessarily coming from.
Well, that's my point, right? Is like
well, but no, neither was it grungy. In many cases, I mean, there were these waves of disinheritance and loss of wide ownership of lands in England, and a couple that occurred in the 19th century itself. Yeah. So it wouldn't necessarily be a critique of the old farmstead if it's precisely because the family was disinherited that they had to move to the city. So it's not a critique of what they were leaving behind if they didn't have it.
Sure.
So,
but that's one of Belloc's points. But that sort of speaks to a wider point maybe that I'd like to make about the notion of, in general, my biggest critique of distributism isn't economic, it's theological. But to this point that, wouldn't it be great if everybody owned, or as many people as possible could own the means of their own production? I think that's pretty much the core of distributist thought as I understand it. And the point, though, is when we talk about economics as a practical science and we're trying to describe how human beings actually behave, I wonder how much, in fact, that's actually possible or prudentially possible, right? Some people, a lot of people, perhaps even the majority of people, they're not cut out for the ownership of the means of their own production, right? There's a reason why economies evolved the way that they did, right? And we're looking to explain why things developed the way that they did. And this is one of the first things is we look at is the state of reality, and we try to explain that. And thirdly, or fourthly, just as a highlight, again, I'm just throwing out some thoughts and then we see what happens. This notion of like the capitalist, I know we've talked a lot about, the caricatures of distributism, and I grant that because I come across them a lot. And again, I like to have fun being polemical against them, but in all fairness, Evan, I think you've represented them pretty well. But I think there are also caricatures of capitalism as, Joe, you might have used this phrase in our text messages over the last week about the exploitation of the poor. And the thing about capital, if you remove from, oh, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Are you saying that I misrepresented capitalism?
No. Like, but you would, I think you would.
I gave voice to it.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
All right. Just to be clear for our audience here.
Yeah. Sure. Right. But for the actual capitalist, right, just the way that this works, if the capitalist wants to continue the return on his investment, if he actually wants to make use of his wealth, he has to put it towards some sort of good and some sort of activity and some sort of investment, right? Some sort of work or business that hires others or whatever, right? If the capitalist were truly to hoard his money in his mattress, then he couldn't even live well. This is sort of the critique of like the Ebenezer Scrooge, right? The guy that's really, really rich, but who dresses really shabbily, who has only like one coal on the fire or whatever. And it's like, that's a really shitty kind of life, right? It right. really is, right?
That that's Aristotle's man opposed to liberality, who has excess in taking but not in giving.
Yeah, and so like really like the capitalist, if you want to use that phrase, right? If he actually wants to continue the increase of his wealth, it actually has to be invested in a business that's providing some service, hiring workers, whatever, right? And to a certain extent, it needs to be done well. Granted, there are abuses. I'm not trying to say that there are never abuses or anything like that. Like I'm just throwing out highlight points.
We'll leave aside whether the credit economy counts as adding wealth or not.
We can talk about that whenever, right? Because I definitely think the credit economy
because there are a lot of people who stay wealthy as trust fund babies, and it's not because they're producing anything; it's because
absolutely. And there are problems with that, but there are also things to be said for what credit economies make possible, as evidenced. Again, there are historical examples of where credit economies they actually managed to suppress it entirely, and it was disastrous. Mm-hmm. Like people ended up starving to death. Literally, this happened because they actually suppressed the giving and taking of credit. But so yeah, it's a different discussion which I'm willing to have. But I was just again throwing out some points.
Yeah. No, that's good. I think that's fine. I think that the criticism you, if there's a place where I part ways with the distributists, it's in their belief that everybody really is interested in going into running their own business. It's like, yeah, sure, it'd be great. Let's. I mean, I think you could support a modest position instead of, or how to put this. It's like the difference between those people who want to ensure fair play in economics and those people who want an outcome of a certain sort, right?
Yeah, very. Yeah.
I'm more where I agree with the distributists most is in the desire to make sure the game is fair, not necessarily to make sure that everybody has their own business. But the question is how certain do you want to make it that everybody's going to get their own business? And when are you going to be satisfied, and how do you measure the success of your policy? Is it when everybody jumps on board? Well, then that just is property reallocation.
Well, and I think, again, I think we would find ourselves in agreement on that point, right? About the fairness of the game, but that in no way implies the equality of outcome, right?
Right.
Because I am as competition based as anybody, and anybody who wants to get into a market, I think should be able to. But it's an entirely different question. It's an entirely different. That's the thing, but it's like, do you actually have what it takes to succeed in that market? And you might not.
Well, something that struck me earlier back with the household discussion we were having is that in the household, not everybody is overseeing the household, right? So, like, it seems that even in this idyllic sort of situation, there is not only room, but perhaps even a necessity for people to be part of the house. Otherwise, I feel like I know what Evan's typing.
I haven't seen it yet.
I'll wait for it. Just to be sure.
I almost I deleted it. I should.
But it's a private chat just for.
Well,
us,
no, I
so.
just thought, don't throw me into the briar patch. We're getting very close to Politics 1, aren't we?
Yeah.
Exactly. There are certain people we left out. No, I guess in that way,
must not be named to.
I'm too Aristotelian. I'm too Aristotelian on this point to be a distributist. I don't. And notice that
we can't talk about that.
Well, I think that Leo's proposal in some ways makes sense, and even I do think that their vision is more or less. I mean, it's pretty accurately. It's taking everything Leo said, not cherry picking, but pulling it all together and trying to make a system out of it.
Yeah, there's a lot of principles that, if I have to be absolutely honest, right, there's a lot of the principles that the distributists do get right. Where I think they start to err is in the practical application of a lot of these principles, like in real economies or in real markets, or the way people really interact, that I think it starts to fall apart. But as I said, my biggest critique with them isn't even that. Honestly, my biggest critique of the distributists is the fact that the ones who go around saying that distributism is the only Catholic model of economics, and if you're not a distributist, then you're a heretic of some kind. That's the part that burns me the most.
I would say that if you dismiss any concerns about usury, that's a problem, since there's such a long tradition of church teaching opposed to it. I think usury needs
to be defined before you get into that discussion.
Somehow, but it's clearly an important datum from the early church and throughout church history. But so if your capitalism really relies on something that meets the definition, a sensible definition,
whatever that is.
Well, I had one other unrelated question for Evan that I'm supposed to ask here. And it's
don't worry. I think he can hear us through the computer, or maybe not.
Give him a minute here.
Yeah.
I had to ask him about Chesterton and college placements. Oh, okay. So my headmaster asked me a question I didn't know the answer to, but I told him I'd ask you, Evan. He's an old time principal, so he's been running schools his whole life, and he's unsure about how successful the students at this brand new Chesterton school here in Tennessee will be looking for colleges. And part of his concern is that there's no stratification, at least in the curriculum that he saw. Maybe it's just because we're so small right now, but at least his concern is stratifying honors or even AP students out from the rest of the bunch. So the students who want to go apply to Harvard can apply to Harvard, right? He wants them to be able to do that. And I told him I didn't know how successful Chesterton has been ordinarily. If they don't, I didn't even know if they don't have an honors program built into their curriculum or not. And if they don't, I was wondering if maybe just their reputation carries them, or why they decided not to do that, or what. So.
Does your microphone not work? Do you know?
It's AirPods.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you're not even. Okay. Well.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah,
yes, we can hear you.
Okay, my camera has a mic. Okay, we're back in business.
Most webcams have a built-in mic. Yeah.
Well, I got the cheapest one, and I figured that it wouldn't have that feature. But the market was looking out for me. I feel touched by the invisible hand. Okay, so if I understand correctly, the concern is we want to offer, or the school wants to offer, this uniform curriculum, and I think there are a lot of advantages to that, rather than trying.
Is that the Chesterton curriculum? Is it uniform, or is there any honors?
It's there's no electives. It's all just It is what it is, and you take it. That's not entirely true. Languages can sometimes vary if you've completed the Latin sequence, and different schools reckon that differently. Some schools say you have to get up through Latin 2, and then you have the option to take a modern language. Others 3.
All right.
But every Chesterton Academy, so far as I know, has had to have kind of an internal reporting system for assessment and an external facing, right? So, in other words, you don't necessarily want to dull your ability to communicate to the student that he's not doing well by overinflating grades. So maybe you have an internal grading system and you don't necessarily bring kids in on the difference, or parents even early on. But when it comes time to promote them and send them to college, you apply, say, a 4.5 scale for any of the core humanities classes or something like that. So that covers the representation element. You can just do that by if the concern is that a college won't take your school seriously unless you do those kinds of things, that's very easily done. You can modify your report cards and send that along. As for recognition, I don't know that there's anything that Chesterton's Schools Network can do to be on Oxford's radar, beyond just continuing to grow, right? I don't know how, whatever high schools Oxford is aware of, it's only because of some kind of long-standing relationship with that organization. But
do you know what sort of placements your graduates have been able to make?
Well, my particular school didn't have a whole lot of graduates, but we had some go on to Hillsdale, and a good number go on to Hillsdale. Yeah, and that's increasingly difficult to get into.
Yeah.
So, but the key thing was getting good standardized test scores when that mattered.
Right.
Now it's anybody's guess. I don't know. Being able to write an intelligent entrance essay, that's big too. And then we helped them out a little bit by layering on those extra credit points to boost up their GPA a little bit.
Okay.
I don't know what else you can do for the student, and then have your staff write good letters of recommendation too.
Yeah, so I guess he's really probably looking for what you said about adjusting the report cards to make them commensurate, I guess, with other schools that have honors programs or something.
Yeah, that's what honors usually means. Honors usually means some extra GPA points, right?
Back when I was in high school, they gave us like an extra 3 points in your final grade, but we didn't get an altered GPA or anything.
Nor did we at mine. Nope. Mm-hmm. So we had. It's kind of funny. There were some students who were intelligent enough to take honors, but deliberately took only the easier courses, smoked them, and were valedictorians. And the people who took like the honors and AP, because they didn't make any adjustment, were like 10th, 15th in the class.
That's kind of interesting because like when I was a Jesuit, and I'm sure like your high schools, like your GPA was adjusted based on the honors courses and stuff that you took, right? So like somebody like the guys that took all honors and made like B's still made a 4.0 because for the honors courses a B was worth a 4, right? Because their GPA was out of 5. It was possible. Right, so this was the problem I had. So like when I applied to the Naval Academy, one of their standards of admission, just a blanket standard of admission, is that you be in the top 10% of your graduating high school class. And for me, that was impossible because I had a 3.7.
Well,
Cyber Jesuits intervened.
That's right. Shut that guy down, man. No, it's so weird. I thought I hadn't heard of this actually. I think maybe I'd heard of it on the edge of my radar, but I had no idea that my high school did anything that was wrong or different. No. We got 3 points added to our final grade, but 4.0 was the best you got.
Yeah, I think that was more typical back when I was in high school. Anyway, that was more typical. But I think there's been this ramp up in college attendance, right? It's kind of crazy. There's another area that I think could be better for the consumer. That would make markets more efficient if we just had a hammer come through and I don't know. It would probably have to be legal or something like that forced apprenticeship programs out into the private sector and away from the university system. Since that's an example of a business that's still running, but is more expensive for everyone involved: the school itself, the industry, and the person who gets the training, since it doesn't really do anything for them.
Yeah.
You know, and what's weird is that it defies some so-called laws in that there's still a ton of demand for it. Like nobody wants it to go away, but nobody's willing to be the first, say, 10,000. Nobody wants to be part of the first 15,000 that just calls the bluff and says no.
Well, I don't know. Like I know one family in particular that was in my youth ministry years ago, and the oldest one went to college, didn't finish, and he's not doing well. The youngest one is in jail, and the middle boy went to school to be a plumber, and he's doing great.
Yeah.
You know, there are definitely stories out there like that.
No, that's fine. I'm just saying that the university system, that there are things that the university system is handling, training, that could be handled in the private sector, and it would be cheaper for everybody involved. The university system artificially inflates the cost of, say, computer tech training, which could be done by experts within the field, and you'd save. The student would save. The industry would get laborers faster. It wouldn't have to be a 4-year program. And that's actually what we're seeing with the emergence of these like coding boot camps that train people faster, more thoroughly, and guarantee them positions. And I guess one of the things, because I know I spent most of this time, I told you I'm not a card carrying distributist, although I'm sympathetic with a lot of what they have. A lot of their concerns, I think that they identified some real ones. They would cheer on that kind of stuff from the sidelines. They'd say, yes, why don't we? They drum up social support for like shifting things back toward apprenticeship programs rather than state-backed university programs. Like we don't, like, what is it? There was a time when you just went to the police academy before you became an officer, learned what you needed to learn after high school, and boom, you're good to go. Now you need a 4-year degree, and then you need to go to the police academy.
Right.
And that's
to make $40,000 a year.
Right. That's all at a cost to the person entering it. And it didn't seem to really alter the quality or caliber. Because we know that most 4-year degree programs are kind of, unfortunately, they're jokes, right?
Yeah.
4-year party spree.
Yeah.
Bacchanal that lasts 4 years.
On the one hand, if every college was actually providing a real education, then in the abstract, I would want as many people to go there as I can, right? But the real problem is not that there's too many people going or whatever. It's that they're going and they're literally just blowing years and tens of thousands of dollars on absolutely worthless.
Or their minds are being ruined by ideology.
Or even worse. They're either getting nothing but like brute facts that they're going to forget, or even worse, they're being indoctrinated into some, perverse ideology.
Right. Yeah, but I think in the technical, in the world of the trades, there are things that could be reassumed by the markets. Now, there's an economic disincentive in that if you're a certain kind of business and your training is hired entirely out, or is handled entirely out of house, it's hard to get businesses to shoulder the cost and say, we'll take on apprentices so that we get what we want. But, it wouldn't take that much of an incentive to get people to make that jump. Just a little bit. When you're talking about huge scale economies, just little disincentives can be enough to flip the switch and make a business say, oh, we're going to start handling our own stuff in-house. And that turns into a much better experience for the guy who's getting the training too. Also more likely to stay in the area, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
That's another thing that economies of scale can do that has a certain spiritual downside, that namely that people will chase jobs all over the place. And I know I'm a hypocrite here, but or rather not, but whatever. There's value in people getting training and then staying in the place where they received the training and improving the economy where they are and deepening relationships rather than encouraging too much fluidity. So if a society got out of control, I'm not saying some fluidity is bad, but just as I wouldn't say alcohol is intrinsically bad, but if you're a ruler of a town and everybody is drunk all day, every day, you might have to impose some austere measures, right?
That's not. So I was working for Verizon before I went to graduate school, and I remember they had a program where they would pay for your MBA, but you had to agree to work with them for 5 years.
Yeah.
Right. Like that sort of agreement seems fair, right?
Yeah,
reasonable. like, because they can benefit. And by the time you've been in the company 5 years, you might have well moved up and decided to make a career there, and they can mutual benefit, right? I liked a lot of the things Verizon did, not everything, but yeah, I could see that sort of working. And on the other hand, I know a buddy of mine works the tech side of an insurance company, and he says that the graduates they get from 4-year programs now have been so bad that the company has started their own like 6 to 12 month probationary training period just to make sure these guys actually know what their degree says they already know, because the degrees are so unreliable. But then, and what should happen, right, is the market should, and I think as this sort of training program speaks to, correct, right? If the degrees no longer have value, then employers are going to stop valuing them as much. And eventually they might end up somehow working with other local training companies or making their own training subsidiary or something like that to make sure that people know what they need to know.
Well, one thing that's tricky about that, as I was suggesting earlier, is that when it comes to prestige items, and a degree is partially training and actual skills, or it should be, but there would still be value attached to it purely because of prestige. And that's not necessarily something that's an intangible that's hard to model, again, on the old classical systems. But it does motivate huge, huge markets, right?
What do you mean by, you're going to have to explain to me what you mean by that.
Just the value of being able to tell people you have a degree from such and such a place.
Is that really the thing? Like,
it's a big Ivy League thing for sure.
Well, this is true, and this is how far out of touch.
Or if you're a first generation college student, being the first person in your family.
Okay, but this is how far out of touch I'm willing to admit I am with contemporary society. But like, if somebody came and told me that they have a degree from Harvard, that doesn't mean squat to me, because I know what they teach at Harvard.
No, I'm just saying. I'm not saying you do, Phil. I'm just saying that people make economic choices that have very little to do with the quality of the good that's involved, purely because of the prestige they think they'll get as a consequence. And that's not understood in purely economic terms. It's not like this will give me X dollar amounts. I think there are a lot of decisions that people make in our economy that are motivated by how they think they'll be perceived.
I'll admit that. That's true.
I don't want to seem like a cheap guy, so I'm gonna get the $12 bottle of wine I've never had before, even though I know this $3 is perfectly good. But those kinds of decisions do happen, and it has nothing to do with the quality of the item as such. Maybe there's an inference that's taking place, but it's not even that the quality of the wine is primarily what's in focus. It's that you don't want to appear cheap.
Well, it means you value that higher than the actual cost of the good.
Right. But I think that motivates huge sections of our economy. Unfortunately,
I'm not saying it.
There are whole markets premised on this.
Sure, but I think that's also perfectly explainable on the classical model. Although I think the classical model has its own problems.
But what use does it have? How is that wealth?
Well, it wasn't based on use, it wasn't based on use. Yeah. It was in fact it was at least the Austrian school is almost entirely based off of just what you value, and how you make certain decisions based on how you order the goods that you're acting for. And I think that's perfectly explainable.
But if you
you value, in the example you gave, you valued not being seen as a cheapskate more than the value of that bottle of wine or whatever. And so of course you're going to buy the more expensive one to avoid being seen as a cheapskate.
Right. But you're also not a rational consumer to the extent you make that choice.
Depends on really what you mean by rational there.
But rationality is partially, there's a back and forth. Somebody like Mises, there's a reciprocal relationship between his characterization of rationality and some of his market mechanisms, such that if you make a choice that violates fundamentally, like cost diminishing your interest, like this bottle of wine jumped up in $12, and that piques your interest, and you want it, that's the limit. Those are the soft limits in Mises's theory for whether you count as a rational consumer anymore.
This is true on just what it means to be a rational consumer in the classical model, which I have my own problems with, especially when, as you're pointing out, there are a lot of instances you could point to where it's like people do make choices that to them it makes sense, but to anybody else who's looking at them, right? Anybody else who's observing this behavior, it's like why would you do that? Now, to them, it's because they have a certain hierarchical order of values, but to everybody else, you would say, why would you choose this at all?
Right. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that Mises is more normative than he thinks he is. Like he's trying to tell you that I'm giving you a purely descriptive account of human transactions.
Yeah, he's wrong about that. The same thing with Hayek.
Yeah, right.
Who's giving you an entirely moral account while at the same time saying that he can't ground a moral foundation for anything.
Right.
Yeah. That's right.
Right.